coast in full retreat. They leave in their wake a military and political void. For the first time in more than 400 years, the vulnerable island nation of Britain must fend for itself. It was the end of one empire and the beginning of another.
The sun never sets on the British Empire. I've heard those words all my life, ever since I was a kid, even though I've never lived in England, and that empire is long gone. Hello, I'm Peter Weller. At its height, the British Empire covered almost a quarter of the Earth's land mass, some 14 million square miles, and if you think about that, that's just staggering. But how did an island, if you will, in the middle of the North Atlantic come to be such a behemoth empire? Well, in the early 400s AD, when those Roman citizens were fleeing in the face of an onslaught of Vikings and Jutes and Angles and Saxons, some of those marauding and plundering people decided to stay. Maybe they liked the temperate climate. And after several centuries, they'd organized and developed themselves into somewhat of an Anglo or English identity. But with the death of the last true Saxon king, Edward the Confessor, the door was open for another people to step in, the Normans, who were essentially descendants of the Vikings living in northern France. And at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, the Normans did that very thing. They took England under the leadership of a man named William, who we call today William the Conqueror.
With a ravenous lust for power, William would stop at nothing to become King of England.
To conquer another country like England, you couldn't really be a sort of touchy-feely kind of person. You had to be a very strong leader, and that's what he was. He was a brutal man.
In 1066, William made his move. He put together an army of Normans and stormed the shores of England. For several bloody hours, his forces viciously clashed with King Harold's near the English coastal town of Hastings. By the end of the day, with one strike, William had conquered England. Now he would borrow a chapter from the Romans and launch a series of extraordinary building projects that would transform the English landscape.
He imposes himself on England, and he builds these castles around the country. Now, we look at castles and we think, don't they look nice? A Norman castle is not nice. It was big, it towered over your town, and it was a reminder to say that you are under us now. And of course, the biggest one he builds is the Tower of London.
William wanted the Tower of London to be intimidating. He chose a location on the bank of the River Thames that had once been used by the Romans. The new tower would be built on those foundations, capitalizing on the Roman legacy of power and glory. The complex would include a defensive wall surrounding an imposing tower.
Can get rid of me. Of course, the people they use to build it are the locals who have to do it, so they use them effectively as slave labor.
Building onto the remains of the Roman walls, workers first constructed the barrier around the complex. On the north and west side, where there were no Roman remains, they dug ditches and erected large wooden stakes as a barricade. Then they turned to the massive tower itself. For 700 years, England had relied on simple timber construction. Now, William and the Normans would bring back the grandeur of Roman engineering techniques. Like the Romans, William would build his tower with stone. He didn't trust the quality of the local material, so he imported cream-colored limestone from France. His engineers also incorporated Romanesque arches and vaults within the structure for support. Inside the tower's majestic cathedral, workers constructed a series of intersecting barrel vaults called groin vaults. These allowed the support to rest on 4 piers, opening a soaring space for windows to lighten the imposing interior.
It was a great feat for that time because the English were used to building in wood, so I think it was rather miraculous for them to see this enormous structure go up. It was really impregnable. I mean, the the walls were tremendously thick, and there were just little slits to look out from.
The fearsome castle served as a royal residence, fort, stronghold, and prison. And intimidation was backed up by swift and severe reprisal against any who dared challenge the king.
You get armed men, and they go up, and they land on your doorstep. They will drive you out of your home. They will burn your home down. They will burn your crops, so you've got nothing to live on. And a lot of killing, of course.
As the tower neared completion in 1087, William died, ending 21 years of turbulent rule. His imposing fortress would be a reminder of his vision and tyranny for centuries to come. A series of Norman kings succeeded William and continued his work on the complex. But it would be more than 400 years later that the tower would enter its bloodiest phase. And the king who led it there was not Norman, but from the English family of Tudors. He would become one of the most brutal and gluttonous rulers in England's history. His name was Henry VIII. Henry's appetites were legendary. He hungered for food, for women, for power, and for a son who would one day inherit the crown.
The best way to fulfill your duty and your destiny as a king is to produce a safe line of male heirs. And if you look at the portraits of Tudor gentlemen, they're standing with their legs apart and their hands on their hips with these big codpieces. That is not by accident. That is saying, I am virile. Look at me, I can produce families. So a son is a sign of manhood.
When his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, failed to produce a son, Henry set his sights on one of her ladies-in-waiting, the alluring Anne Boleyn.
He falls absolutely hopelessly in both in love and in lust with Anne Boleyn, because Anne is a very, very sexy lady, and she knows it. There's only one problem. How do you get rid of your wife? Apart from murdering her, of course. And the answer is, you've got to divorce her.
When the Pope refused to grant Henry a divorce, the king flew into a rage. If he couldn't control his country's religion, he would simply replace it. He boldly severed all ties with Rome and appointed himself head of the new Church of England. Henry now had absolute control over his country. He divorced Catherine and made Anne his queen. But when she also failed to produce a son, she suddenly found herself accused of adultery.
The case is made as damaging as it's possible to be, that she's not just having one affair, that she's having a string of affairs, that there are sort of orgies going on in the palace, and Henry is only too ready to believe a lot of this.
Henry had Anne arrested and held in the greatly expanded Tower of London. By now, the tower complex had grown to a sprawling 18 acres with an impenetrable facade. The wooden barricade had been replaced and expanded by thick stone walls. A series of towers reinforced their strength and stability. Just inside the outer wall, a second wall was constructed to provide another layer of fortification. A ditch had been dug around the perimeter and filled with water to form a moat. With these added defenses, the tower complex was virtually undefeatable. Under Henry's ruthless reign, the fortress became the location for an orgy of violence, a notorious prison, dungeon, and execution ground for his many enemies. And it was here that Anne awaited her fate, death by beheading.
Axe executions were actually really nasty because it was not uncommon for the axe not to finish the job in one blow. What he does with Anne Boleyn, he says, for you, darling, nothing but the best. Instead of having her beheaded with an axe, he's going to have her beheaded nice and neatly with a sword.
On May 19th, 1536, Anne was led to a private courtyard on the tower's grounds. With one swift stroke, Henry's problem was solved. But Henry's longing for a son was only part of a more ambitious quest. Since the beginning of his reign, he had lusted after a dream of ultimate glory, to transform England into an empire.
This idea of a realm that would cover every part of Europe and extend beyond was always in the back of Henry VIII's mind. His real vision and dream, his great appetite was for dominion and empire.
But Henry's road to empire put him on a collision course with France and Spain, Europe's reigning superpowers. His plan of attack, to fill the high seas with floating weapons of mass destruction. 6 ravens are always kept at the Tower of London. Legend has it that if they leave, the kingdom will fall. Summer 1510. An army of laborers scour England's forests, gathering material for a colossal undertaking on England's road to empire. Before King Henry VIII could conquer the land, he needed to conquer the sea. He set out to radically transform the way battles were fought and won by turning his ships into deadly weapons.
He is the one who first begins putting heavy guns on ships. To put these large siege warfare type guns, ship cracking guns, some of them weighing almost a ton, on shipboard that could be used to batter your enemy into submission.
Massive guns required massive ships. Henry ordered his naval engineers to build a new and imposing fleet. The centerpiece, his flagship, was one of the world's first battleships. It was called the Mary Rose.
The Mary Rose really epitomizes the mentality of naval planners of that age. Get as many guns pointing as many directions on shipboard as you possibly can. And that's what the Mary Rose was set to become, a gun platform.
The Mary Rose featured a breakthrough advance in warship design, gun ports. Holes were carved into the side of the ship with flaps that could be lowered over them. These holes allowed cannons to be positioned and fired through the side. Naval designers could now engineer decks dedicated solely to firepower. The added weapons turned the Mary Rose into a killing machine.
This was a major revolution, really, in ship design, of which the Mary Rose was the sort of very beginning.
By the mid-16th century, England's march toward naval dominance was in full flow. But Henry soon ran into a problem. The cost of arming his ships with expensive bronze guns was quickly draining England's treasure chest.
He's got to find other ways to produce the kinds of, heavy artillery, which can help his armies and his navy fight effectively, but at a lower cost. And the cast iron gun's the perfect solution. The cast iron gun runs less than a fifth of the cost of a bronze one.
A successful cast iron cannon had never been made before, but Henry knew how to make it happen. He turned to the country's famous iron-making region, the Weald, and gave his engineers a mandate.
The difficulty with casting in iron a large piece like a cannon was the fact that, for a start, iron had to be melted at a much higher temperature.
There was only one way to get the temperatures high enough, an engineering wonder of the time, the blast furnace. First, workers poured wood and iron ore into the top of a 20-foot-tall stone furnace. A water wheel powered a large bellows that pumped air into the fire, stoking it until it reached an incredible 2,200 degrees, hot enough to melt the iron. Workers then opened a tap at the base of the furnace. A stream of hot molten iron poured down a trough and filled a cannon mold